Okay, ladies and gentlemen, prep time is over. Welcome to the round. Welcome to the ESL semi-final of EUDC 2020. Congratulations to all teams for making it thus far. We have Warwick A, Leiden C, Streitkultur A, and Leiden B. Congratulations, all teams. Before we begin the debate, may I just check that all judges are here, audible, and we know their preferred pronouns. So if the judges can just briefly introduce themselves. Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan. I don't have any preferred gender pronoun and just want to say best of luck to all teams.
Thank you very much. Joseph?
Hi, I'm Joseph. You can refer to me as he or they, please. Also, good luck.
Perfect. Mila?
Hi, I'm Mila. I have no gender pronoun preferences and very excited to be judging this round as well. Good luck.
And Seyong?
Hi, she or they is fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Yoni. I'll be the chair for this round. He or they is fine. Thank you. If I may ask the speakers to introduce themselves in speaking order and let us know if they have preferred pronouns. So Warwick A, who's speaking first and second, and preferred pronouns, please.
Speaking first is Rafael. He or they, please.
And speaking, yes?
And speaking second, Lucy, please.
Thank you very much, Lucy. For opening our position, Leiden C.
Lou speaking first, here day.
Cat second, please.
Leiden C, that was barely audible. Would you mind trying again?
Does it work now? Does this function?
It is better the closer you get to the microphone. Okay. Yeah, right now it's loud and clear. I'm not sure I can expect you to give your entire speech like that, but we could barely hear you otherwise.
We will do that. It's fine.
Okay, thank you very much, Leiden C. For Streitkultur A in closing government.
So Maria speaking first, Samuel speaking second, here it is fine for.
Okay, Streitkultur, you definitely had a lag there. I would suggest
my internet is better. It's Marius first, Samuel second, here they.
Okay, yeah, so that right now, that wasn't lagging, it was just less audible. So I do suggest you use the latter account, but perhaps speak louder and more directly into the microphone, and we'll do our best. We'll turn off our cameras and so on to hear you clearly. And lastly, in closing opposition, Leiden B.
Hi, who is speaking first? No preference.
Romeo speaking second, she or they, please.
Okay, so we could definitely hear the latter speaker better. So I would suggest whoever's speaking, sit there and speak directly into the microphone. Wonderful. I hope that we will not experience any technical difficulties in the debate itself. And if everyone's ready, just please, all the speakers, please time the speeches for purposes of both speaking time and POIs. I remind everyone that if the speaker had not taken a single POI by 5:45, you may unmute yourself and give an audible POI as a last chance if the speaker had not taken a POI before. So if everybody's ready, on the motion that this House believes that countries should suspend all elections in times of severe health crises, I am very happy to call upon the Prime Minister from Warwick A to start the debate. Here.
Panel, three things in this speech. Firstly, how we think the severe health emergencies look like. Secondly, why we believe this affects how the crisis is handled, and therefore like really, really important things regarding how many people live. Lastly, why we believe that actually these elections, if they do happen, would not be reflective of democracy and likely to be to bad outcomes, even if you care about things like democracy more than life and human rights. Okay. Firstly, why we think that this, how do we think that this crisis looks like? I mean, I think the clearly has in mind things like coronavirus, but we do also think it applies to other sort of pandemics. It might also apply to things like, say, for example, I mean, just basically those severe health crises, which like fundamentally affect the ways in which states can function in a way not dissimilar to say how something like a war would do so. And like again, we already believe there are analogies in the ways in which these sort of things are handled in terms of war, for instance. Firstly, why we believe this is going to affect how the crisis is handled. Before going into this argument, it is really important to point out we believe this is an incredibly important point in this debate. Why is this the case? Firstly, because when we're talking about a sort of health emergency, we're talking about the literal lives of like massive amounts of people, and especially in this health emergencies, the people that are most at risk are the most vulnerable people, oftentimes ethnic minorities and so on, that have less access to healthcare and so on. So we really, really care about this. Also note that once you lose your life, you can never win it again. If you lose your life, if you lose your right to vote for 1.5 years, you can probably get it back in 1.5 years. Before continuing, I'll take a clarification from CO.
So who's gonna decide when the election will be held?
Okay, we basically believe the election should be held whenever the crisis ends. We believe there are objective metrics in which you can decide when the crisis ends. We believe that at first we'll allow national governments to decide for themselves when the crisis ends. If after organizations like WHO know that there is no crisis anymore, and these countries are not deciding to hold elections, we would treat it like any country that is not deciding to hold elections, and you can do things to pressure them into doing so. So at first it will be domestic, but there will be an international safeguard, the same way it currently exists in most places in the world. Anyways, so why do we think it's actually going to be really, really bad for the way the crisis is held? So note several things. Firstly, note that oftentimes the sort of things that are really good pandemic responses, things that are actually quite unpopular, right? It is things like, for instance, once you've opened up lockdown, just going back into lockdown, and once people had begun feeling normal again and happy again and seeing their friends and family for the first time after a few months, it is literally putting them back into lockdown, which is like basically house arrest and stuff like that. Note that therefore those things are actually quite unpopular, and if politicians have the short-term incentive of whether the people on the ground like them at that specific point, then they're likely to do things because they're selfish that will actually make the people like them. This is especially true because of the sort of effects, like the negative effects you get from those things are also not things that happen immediately, are things that happen in 2 or 3 months, months time down the line, right? Which means that you have the incentives to do the irresponsible thing now, to open up back the economy so that like there are more jobs being created, and like again to allow things for social parties and social unions and stuff like that, and just win the election. And then when things go bad, that is something completely different, especially because most terms last for 4 or 5 years, which means that things, even if things actually go bad in the first year, like after you've won the election, you have again 3 or 4 years in which the people are more likely go to forget, and you can just do so many different things during this time to actually end up making the people forget. This is also important because it colors the way in which the opposition and people that are meant to people that are meant that are not the government themselves also act, right? Why? Because we believe that when you have an election, the opposition no longer just has incentives to like govern well, but they have the incentive to differentiate themselves from the ruling party. They have the incentive to make the ruling party look in the bad light. They have the incentives for to allow the ruling party to commit massive awful mistakes, right? Because if they allow them to do so, it becomes much more electorally convenient for them. That means that there's going to be things like opposition grow needlessly antagonistic and antagonistic for no reason. It also means the opposition trying to discredit the ways in which the current government is operating, and this is especially important given that oftentimes at the national level and the local level you have different parties in power, right? So it looks things like, for example, if you have a conservative right-wing government, it looks like liberal or left-wing like mayors trying to undermine that authority, given that again they're competing for election and like they probably want to be elected and so on and so forth. We believe this fundamentally affects the way in which the crisis is handled for the worse. This means that more people end up dying, and crucially, their deaths are actually non-reversible. This is especially important because we also believe that this is actually not going to lead to such great democratic outcomes. Why is this the case? Several reasons why this is the case. So note several things. Firstly, note that we don't believe that the sort of votes people will make in the middle of a pandemic or a health emergency are actually going to be the most informed votes. So note that when you, it's not just about randomly voting, it's also making an informed decision where you take into account all variables, where you take into account everything the government can do and all the ways in which your government can change your life. Note that the moment in which you have a pandemic, there's going to be an overwhelming present bias, and you're going to overwhelmingly focus on the things that are going to happen in the next 6 months, 1 year, maybe 1.5 years, right? Which means that you're less likely to look into things that are going to happen in the long run. Like in the long run, we don't believe the choice will necessarily be as informed. Also note that several things. Also note that, for instance, when you have an emergency, you're likely to be more sympathetic towards things like emergency powers and towards things like concentrating power in the hands of the executive. Note that those things might actually be useful at the time of elections, but not necessarily things that are good in the long run and are good for accountability. And the moment at which you end up having those things at the moment, it means that it's likely for governments to run on like stronger centralization and more authoritarian presidents are actually more likely to gain power in a legitimate democratic way for the sort of things that they're currently doing. Before continuing, I'll take a non-clarification POI from closing if not opening.
Okay, which national leaders are currently doing well in elections?
I'm not sure. Like, not a lot of elections have actually been held. like again, there are several nationalities that are doing good, or like others are not bad. Anyways, continuing. Also, crucially, okay, there's also the issue of mail-in ballots, right? First, we tell you that, I mean, there are very intuitive reasons why it might be true that mail-in ballots are maybe not the safest thing in the world. Things that other people living in your address can do, so things that it's very hard to verify who you are. But crucially, and this is the very, very important link, it doesn't really matter if mail-in ballots can actually be made safe, and if you can have procedures to make them safe. The point is, most people have never experienced these sort of things, and most people can point to very intuitive ways in which mail-in ballots could be corrupted, even if they're not actually corrupted in those ways. The point is that then people don't really trust elections as much, because you have elections that have never occurred in this way and are now occurring in this way, and especially given that oftentimes now elections happen on like relatively close margins, like 5 or 10%. Like 10% is like a massive win, for any one party. That means that any sort of those wins is likely to be seen as less legitimate, because it just happened in a way in which people think it can and like have intuitive ways to believe, reasons to believe, where it can be easily like misled and easily falsified. It also means that people probably trust the democratic process a little bit less. And again, especially in countries that have fragile democracies, where you really want people to be able to trust 100% every election, but all political actors remain committed to the democratic systems, probably not a good thing. So ultimately, because we solved the pandemic, but also because we don't believe that this democratic process will be perfect or will actually be representative of democracy in the long run, we're taking this debate.
We thank the Prime Minister very much for a fine speech. Leiden C, we will need an audibility check from you again, I'm afraid.
So we got a new mic. Am I audible?
I mean, we will turn up our volume, and I'm going to ask you to kindly just speak a lot louder.
Is this okay?
This is great. This is
okay,
great.
Cool.
Okay, this is a really weird suggestion, but we are in the same house, so I can also walk down with my laptop and give it to them.
I would be fine with that.
Okay, if that would just take a minute or yeah, I think in the interest of having a fair debate, let's do that.
You're going to get a tour of Emma Dad's house.
I've been in debating for a long time. There are still things I have not seen.
Can you?
Okay, Leiden C, let's try you now.
Yeah, is this okay?
Oh, so much better. Okay.
I still need to.
So the leader of opposition, when you are ready, we're very happy to call upon the yellow to start a case for a vote.
Yes. 3, 2, 1. 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, the POI of CAT. Leaders that have responded well are doing great in elections. Who are not Trump, who fucked it up, who are doing great. It is, for example, in the Netherlands, Rutte, who really did well. Those kinds of leaders are doing well now. It is actually quite the same as you would want it to, and as probably Prop would want to. Opposition says that lockdowns are unpopular. Firstly, this is not necessarily true. There's a rally around the flag where your government is doing actually something to the thing that is killing you. That's what people like. Secondly, after like 4 weeks, the numbers go down, and that means that you're happy. This means that there's a very small time frame where propositions material works. Only if there's an election in that time frame, which is very unlikely, they might have a point. Otherwise, not. You see other countries doing extremely bad, and you see your country doing well. That means that you're going to like your government if they're doing well. If not, then you can also vote them out. Opposition has an incentive to be antagonistic, according to the PM. This is not really true. Firstly, if you criticize a policy which is super popular, which we've seen was super popular, that is going to be perceived as bad. That means Labour won by agreeing on the most of the policy, then not agreeing on very small parts, and therefore people like them. And it is always the case that people can still choose, right? So they can still choose whether they like their opposition party like if they are going to be antagonistic, they're going to shoot themselves in the foot. I think the prop case is just basically untrue in the real world. Why are you going to have a breaking down of rule of law and government's going to become more authoritarian? Firstly, 3 reasons why it's already easier. There's harder to have checks from courts and parliaments because they're sometimes not in session, or you can close them down because of the pandemic. Secondly, you're going to have a focus on the crisis, so you don't care about sort of fake principles as a rule of law. You only care, basically voters only care about the last 2 months, and they're not going to care about these or less about this kind of things. You can already do more under a crisis. For example, take away privacy through hygiene apps or closing courts. Now, that's already easy. If you postpone an election, that means that it's going to be a long while and there's a little check. This means there's a bigger benefit of taking away the rule of law because you know you are going to be in parliament. If you're taking it away and then the election next, like you cannot like completely abolish it in one go. So that means that there's an election which is going to be sort of fair. And if that means that the opposition party is going to be in power, that means that they have the benefit of you eroding the rule of law. And that means because governments can do more, that means your opposition party can do more. That's not necessarily something that you want. Therefore, you're not going to do it on our side of the house because you know there's going to be an election. You're much more likely going to do it on their side of the house. It is especially since governments can become more authoritarian. Proposition says that they will become more authoritarian because people like it, and if it's close to an election, they will basically become more authoritarian. One, I don't think that people necessarily like it. People usually hate it when governments can be more intrusive into their lives. They don't necessarily want that. Usually there's a culture of democracy. But secondly, if people like it, they will do it anyway if there's an election or not, because governments are not usually like, oh, I desperately want this rule of law, right? So they will basically do it anyway under Gov, that point where you didn't stand. That means the second thing there is that you have no idea when the election is going to be happening. The proposition says it's objective when the crisis ends. I have no idea when the crisis ends. If 0.1% of the people is infected, does that mean that the crisis ends? Is it 0.5%? Nobody knows. But the government can decide on this because the government is basically like doing this, right? That means sort of parliament can decide, but if you are taking down their sort of checks and balances, if you are taking down the court's checks and balances, that means that it becomes easier for you to postpone and postpone and postpone in the future. This authoritarian 101. Every time you take a step, it becomes harder to reverse because you get more freedom as a government. Every time you close down a media station, that means that there's less opposition and less criticism against you, meaning that you can do more and more, and it's extremely hard to reverse because you act like you need the rule of law to reverse that, right? But you're taking away from that. That means more authoritarianism. The impact when a crisis ends is objective. It's going to be too late because you're already taking down important things which make sure that we live in free and democratic societies. There's already a harm. It's not that objective when the crisis ends. It means more countries like Hungary closing down and Israel closing down courts at the moment the crisis ends. This means people being able to take down media because they're like criticizing the government. This is extremely harmful to our democracies. Why should voters also have a say on crisis management? It's the second argument. Firstly, it's one of the biggest things in democracy that there is a check on power. Indirect democracy means that you don't always have a direct say on policies, but at least you can vote the people away if you think they're doing a bad job. Firstly, there's an objectively good and bad job here. You can screw it up like President Trump or Boris Johnson, where they don't communicate to people, where they don't trust science, where they are letting the virus go out of hand. That is what you get. Closing.
Okay. Why is it good if the entire election is based on your handling of the crisis, if the person in power is in power for the next 5 years and has to handle a lot of other issues?
Because people can decide whatever is good for them. So if they want to talk about crises, that is absolutely fine. Secondly, if a government is really effective at solving crises, probably they're also good at other things. managing crisis is also a political question. You can talk about lockdowns. You can talk about whether you want to open up a country for business and those kind of things. It's also a political question. What exactly you want to do? People should have a vote on that. Why can voters do it? Safe voting is possible. Firstly, hygiene. Secondly, mail-in ballots, which are fine. No reason from probe why they're not fine. People are not that scared because it often happens after the initial scare and people get sort of used to it. And there's more focus on government policy. So it means that people are actually involved more in politics. People are extremely informed. People have a lot of free time. That's why Black Lives Matter movements happened. They are literally following the news about this crisis every single day. Never we are so informed about what our government is doing in our lives. It's easy to compare your nation with other nations, and the media has constantly do it since it's a global crisis. People are never such informed as normally. We think this is great votes which you want to have. If there's no check, you have to rely on opinion polls, which people can deprioritize because it's only decisive later and they don't reflect well in crises. Structural problems and efficacy don't get voted away. You should oppose.
Thank the Leader of Opposition very much for a fine speech. And if everyone's ready, I'm very happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for OG.
Am I audible? Can someone thumbs up if you can hear me well? Excellent. If I can ask for POIs, if you can wave it at me on the video. Cool. Three things in this speech. First, responses on the stuff about rule of law and dictatorships. Secondly, why these elections would not be, in fact, according to democratic norms. So if you care about democracy, that's where we are winning as well. Lastly, on where we handle crisis better, you probably care about people's lives. I think that's important. On rule of law, the first thing they say is, no one knows where crisis ends, so it will be all like subjective and up to the government. Not that RAF already pre-responds to it and they don't really engage with that. Like, notice you can quite reasonably objectively see when crisis ends. There are international measures and international statistics. There are obvious like levels of danger that are set by the WHO or other similar organizations, which you can still point out. Like you can't, unless you are already a massive autocracy, which we don't think is probably in this debate, you can't like completely fake your statistics. Also, you can compare yourself to other countries. You can probably engage on that. Like, objectively, you probably won't be like, you won't be able to extend crises forever if there's no longer an epidemic in your country. That's unrealistic. The second thing then is in terms of like the horrible dictatorships measures that like can be installed, like, or media is going to be shut down, etc., etc. In the first thing, like in most countries where this happens, again, it doesn't particularly apply because these countries already have would already have probably quite rigged elections on either side of the house. In countries where there is a democratic culture from before, you usually tend to have some sort of other checkups. It's things like you probably have some sort of international pressure. Like if EU countries do it, you still have EU institutions who are able to check up on this and who are able to exert some sort of pressure from above. We think there are incentives to comply with that sort of pressure and don't do anything absolutely horrendous, because otherwise we probably have problems on economic basis as well in terms of international cooperation. Most countries which talk about in this debate won't do it. Secondly, we also think that prior to doing this postponement of elections and during handling crisis, you already tend to have something like establishing technocratic some sort of technocratic committees which are checking up on the government, right? Like you have scientific or health experts who are commenting with the government, who are and the government is forced to explain exactly why they are doing the measures they are doing. This is obviously a I think, quite clear measures that happen in democratic countries. We don't think like that all countries can just go wild and like out of massive dictatorship measures. If they do so, they've already had the chance anyway. Like the last response is, we think this gets worse on their side of the house if you buy all the stuff about like these dictators are going to go wild. Because note that for the reasons I'm going to explain later, if you do hold elections mid-pandemic and you campaign specifically on the pandemic and how you are handling it, and if you are someone who has an autocratic tendency and wants to do things like cutting freedom of press, etc., you are probably able to gaslight the population quite well and explain why this is something that is necessary, which means that if you, on their side, you actually get elected mid-pandemics, you get to stay for 5 more years, which is presumably far longer than like before the crisis would end. And secondly, you are staying in power with incredible amount of legitimacy, because now it's no longer just you are doing it for the time of pandemic and then you have to stop, but now you have a complete power to be able to apply this throughout your entire time in power, because you can say you were legitimately elected even though like people didn't have the chance to reflect on all the other things that you might be going for. We think because of that, like if you actually care about like rule of law, we are winning. Second thing then, why we think that these elections will not be democratic and according to any democratic norms. Like the first thing we tell you that there will be lack of information on other issues, right? Like insofar as the health crisis so profoundly impacts individuals and impacts their lives specifically, like they can't make informed decision about any other issues that they will realistically be facing within these 5 years, right? Like you won't be thinking about like your economic situation that you might want to have in 4 years. You won't be thinking about education. You won't be thinking about any of these things at the point at which like there's such a pressing issue of the health, right? What this means is that people are likely to make short-term decisions and uninformed decisions. Know that they say, but like whatever, we don't care. Like, no, this is completely different than just like single voting on a single issue in a normal situation, because this is something that was imposed on you. Like the pandemic obviously didn't choose to have this. It means that this is something that like profoundly affect the way you are able to like evaluate your moral choices and values upon which you vote. We think that it's like simply illegitimate to make people vote in the situation instead of like 6 months later when they're actually able to like actually exercise that like their democracy and assign value to the things they want to be valued. The second thing we tell you is that some groups won't be able to engage with these elections like completely, right? Know that in many things, such as like campaigns outside or campaigns like knocking on doors and similar things, are unable to be done during the pandemics. Again, this knocks out a lot of like vulnerable or disenfranchised populations who might not be able to like access like hustling videos on internet, which are obviously just like which specifically can target just a group of population, which means again the result you get is skewed both on the issues and also on the demographics that gets to be involved. We think that's also problematic. Also, you get more like social bubble engagement insofar as everything's done like through the internet. The last thing on safety, right? They tell you, but like they never explain why like internet ballots are unsafe. Like, know that we don't have to. Like, we don't think the safety issue is so important in this debate. Like, just in case CG wants to run it, we don't think that's necessarily the biggest clash. What we told you is that there is a problem with voting, like voting through post or electronic one, in terms of that this is something that is completely new and it hardly ever has been implemented in any country on such level. What this means is that you are likely to have the results of those elections disputed, which is problematic insofar as you have more polarization, more distrust in cases where there could be any. I'll take closing if they have anything. Opening?
Yeah, so if you're gay, that's also imposed on you. Still, you can be a single issue voter on those rights. You need to do more where people can make a decision to vote on this.
Yeah, but okay, if you want to vote on an LGBT issue, this is something that you probably have the ability to profoundly reflect as to why you are voting on that single issue. Most people understand in long term that they need LGBT rights if they are LGBT, right? This is something that you have is impacting you now, and you are forced to make a decision about 5 years. We think comparatively, it is obviously much more democratic if you allow for 6 months of a delay, and then you allow you to actually reflect on what you want to vote at for the next 5 years after. We don't see where the harm of this necessarily is, but we think on the comparative, even if you potentially could have some like sort of legitimacy in that decision, I think this is better. On bad crisis handling, they don't really respond. We tell you that you have short-term incentives for government to downplay the crisis. They say, people like lockdown so they don't die, but also no, most people don't like intrusive government measures. It's one or the other, right? Which is why politicians have an incentive to play down the crisis significantly and make and actually endangers people's lives. Because we are having better democracy and because we are having better crisis handling, all those reasons propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister very much. For the judges already, we're very happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue for a while.
Hi, are we still audible from this laptop? Fantastic. Okay. 3, 2, 1. One quick response to the very sad attempt at engagement with the idea of authoritarianism being something unpopular, but people still being fine with measures that are directly attempting to salvage their health in a manner that is democratically legitimized. Please note, panel, that there is a distinction between authoritarian measures that are culturally despised as being the stuff of authoritarian regimes past, such as, e.g., disabling the judiciary, putting parliament to out of power, making your term limits longer, etc., and measures that are specifically tailored, often with limited time for which they will be effective in terms of limiting a pandemic. That was a sad fucking attempt at response. I honestly think it's vaguely offensive against ESL speakers, but since this is technically an ESL semi-final, I suppose I can't say that. But honestly, let's be real, they're EPL, so I don't care. Okay. I'm sorry, this was fucking rude. Let's move on to the rest of this. 1, on bad crisis handling. Note that in order for opening government to have a delta on this point, they would need to prove that there are otherwise incentives to do a good approach to the crisis, right? They don't do that. We see frequently governments that are currently in power failing horribly at actually resolving a crisis. They say another lockdown is unpopular. Note that there are other reasons for that, so therefore they have no delta. Things like economic pressure, because people want shops to open back up so they don't go unemployed. Note that factories want to open back up so they want to make a lot of, in order to make a lot of profit, which means they will pressure the government using their inequitable lobby power, etc., which, note, is much less unchecked when there's no reason to give a fuck what the population thinks of you right now, because there won't be an election. I think this means things like meatpacking factories being able to pressure the government significantly more easily to do bad crisis handling when OG proves nothing on why crisis handling would otherwise be good. Given the wealth of counter examples, I think they prove nothing. Secondly, personal ideology also goes against this, i.e., I don't think the reason Trump is handling this crisis badly is because there's an election. I think it is because he is ideologically captured by a group of people who really, really likes to say freedom to hurt everyone around us. I don't think that's something that goes away on their side of the house, so they don't win. But secondly, look, they say the opposition is likely to be bad and antagonistic. 1, I think there's a tension between the opposition simultaneously allowing the government to do everything bad, but also being very antagonistic toward the government. So to the degree that top half is a tension question, they have one too. But secondly, note that there's a massive amount of counter incentives. You want to offer facts. You want to show that there are facts that the government hasn't considered yet, because that means the people who are affected by those facts and who currently feel ignored by the government are likely to listen to you. Secondly, you want to show loyalty to your nation and show that you care about doing things well, which means you want to be demonstrating that you are constructively attempting to help the government solve the crisis. Third mechanism, there's a measurability and comparability of results, at which point, if your solution that you're proposing is being done in another country that is doing worse than the country you are in, you will not propose it. Already in Louis, no response. Again, that's fucking sad. Lastly, I think that this is something that's also relative. Maybe you have an opposition party that's like this. I don't think they'll get a lot of votes though, and since opening government never proves they'll get a lot of votes, there's no delta. Why do these counter incentives win out? 1, I think a lot of people in politics are probably in it for public service. They don't want to actively fuck things up at the point where there are people dying. But secondly, I genuinely think that the incentive to fuck up a government marginally and maybe make them look slightly silly is smaller than your incentive to not look like you are being destructive and heartless in the face of people dying. So even if you're not actually a nice person, you want to look like one. And at that point, you're going to be doing the things that I've just told you rather than the things that they did. Moving on toward why voters can make good decisions in crisis. They say, 1, you're short-termist, so it's not representative. Please note these two don't logically follow. You can have valid short-termist preferences because you are facing a short-term crisis that is potentially killing you, potentially killing your grandmother, at which point I think it's probably valid to prioritize that over, maybe this person disagrees with my stance on, like, I don't know, unemployment benefits in some case. But secondly, I think that it's probably true that people always make short-termist choices in elections. I think elections are always based on things like what happened just before, what politician was in the news admitting to an affair, what political bloc or tribe am I a part of, what ideology does my family believe in, and will give me social points to demonstrate that I believe in too. They prove no delta. Mail-in ballots, reality check. Most countries have them. Most countries have used them in like substantial amount. Just because they're controversial in the US doesn't prove anything else. Lastly, I think polarization is not impacted by EUDC, but secondly, they also just don't, like, there is no impact because I think it's somewhat inevitable in a crisis. People are a bit angry and emotional. Lastly, I think on the idea that you have a longer period of time if you are voted in now and there's no possibility to do anything else. There's a very unclear impact. I think you're still more democratically legitimized. Presumably, you also have a limited term in which you can do things, which we have decided is the good term for which we can democratically legitimize people. I'm really not sure how this works. CG has in a POI said, oh, you only vote on the pandemic. 1, that's legitimate. 2, it's improbable because the pandemic is interlinked with other trade-offs and values. It is interlinked with how good your unemployment system is. It is interlinked with how well you pay your nurses. It is interlinked with how well you stocked up before a crisis. It is interlinked with how robust your supply lines are. It is interlinked with how robust your infrastructure is for internet, for working at home, for delivering goods to you when you are stuck. It is interlinked with how you take care of your elderly. This is just fucking nonsense in the proposition bench. Let's move on to our mechanization on why voters can make good decisions. 1, you have access to good information and it will be presented to you in a comprehensible way. Because politicians are all competing on how do I best resolve this problem in an effective manner. I think they are competing on whether they are in that case, they need to show you what they are supposed to be doing. They need to show you that in a way that is measurable and comparable because you have that data. And if they don't, the competition will, and they will look fucking stupid. Secondly, people can evaluate this effectively. Note that this is a time of solidarity where you see people suffering, and in the face of suffering, people are very empathetic because we genuinely cannot look at people suffering without suffering ourselves. But note that you also just observe where your system has failed and where you are interdependent on each other, which means you are likely to take that into account. I think people form very good judgments on this. Why do voters need to have a say? The current politicians were not voted in for this. During the previous election, you didn't realize this might be an issue. You didn't realize you would care about the things that are now killing you. I think probably you were passive. You didn't particularly care about the election. Maybe you didn't vote. This means you need to vote now in order to have your preferences heard at all. Decisions made now are irreversible because at the point where people are dead, that's a problem. Moral weighings in terms of what the priorities are need to be made. Legitimacy is crucial. But also note that everything that we gave you on missing checks and balances, when I'm completely unresponded to, opening government loses this debate. Very happy to oppose.
Sure thing, Leiden. We thank the DLO for a fine speech. And I'm sorry, Leiden, would you inform me when the laptop has been picked up? So are both Leiden teams ready?
Oh yeah, like Louis accidentally shut it off or to sabotage us. So if you can have 1 minute to get back in the Zoom, that would be great.
So should I wait now?
No, I think it's safe to say both Leiden teams are ready.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So without further ado, I'm very happy to call upon the member of government to start the case for the closing government. Here.
Our case in closing government is very simple. We're saying citizens' feedback is bad in many ways during a crisis because at different stages you have to understand different concepts of the debate, of the crisis that often sound counterintuitive. Because of this, at any given point, it's bad to ask your citizens what I should do instead of only the experts and only rely on the experts. We also think, second framing, that representation is the most important metric in the debate because we are talking about democracies, meaning we try to maximize the will of the people, and therefore the team that can show that this is on which side of the house better representation falls wins the debate. First, all rebuttal will be integrated, I'll flag it. First thing, voting safety. Both opening teams just say there are alternatives. We can do mail-in ballots, etc., etc. We are going to show that these are not feasible alternatives in this debate. And therefore extend, because we think that opening government made a mistake in dropping this thing. Okay, first context for voting safety, and voting safety always has implications on representation. Number one, if you have something like an infectious disease, then often these spread even if you wear a mask, because masks are imperfect. You're balled into a big hall where you vote. Often you have insufficient funding for these to make sure that there's sufficient airflow, etc., etc. That means you will spread the disease along your voting block. Secondly, some people are unable to go there because they're specifically sick. That means elderly people or Black people who have less healthcare and worse hospitals in their neighborhoods, meaning they're less likely to be able to vote. Even if they vote from home, if you're in a hospital, you're probably less likely to vote. Or if you are currently having corona, it's less likely that you vote. Even in your alternative world, you still have a distorted thing. That means less representation because specific groups are more likely to be targeted out. White people more likely to vote on your side of the house, Black people, old people less likely to vote, not representatives. Lastly, for specific people, it is not rational to go to the polls and vote in the first place because of systems like gerrymandering and a massive resistance to mail-in voting in a lot of countries. It is likely that people who have to go to specific polling places have to bulk up in gigantic masses because their mailing stations, their ballots have been diminished over the last couple of years, meaning that tons of people would have to go. All of them fear from going because they're afraid of getting the infection or getting sick in the first place. That means that they are more likely to stay at home. These are, again, the minorities we talked about, like Black people and Hispanics in the USA, but also to a lesser extent, but also the principle holds for other countries in the world. Now, opposition and opening also say there are alternatives. We think these alternatives are often not working very well because, for example, introducing mail-in ballots or online voting often comes at a huge cost and is hard to scale up because these systems are not made for 100% of the population, but rather 5% of the population. Suddenly, it's a huge logistics error that you have to suddenly prop up. And during a lot of these times, it is often impossible to do this because suddenly you have to handle logistics that you're unable to handle. Also, if you open voting systems online, this is a massive invitation for other countries to hack the systems, to change your voting system in a specific way, and therefore voter fraud and irrepresentation significantly higher. If you just want to change if you want to change stuff like gerrymandering, it's also unlikely that you're going to do this on your side of the house because all ruling parties have an interest in doing gerrymandering because it helps them. Now, let's go through all of the stages of a pandemic. We realize that opening government has said people have short-termist incentives, but we will show exactly at what stages they kick in and what it means for the voting in the first place. Before the pandemic starts or any spread of disease, you will have people who are saying, I don't see this thing because they don't the average person does not understand what exponential growth means. They have never, this is something that is rarely even taught in most schools if you're not in higher schools, or to the extent that it is emotionally salient for you. Maybe you have seen such a graph at some point, but you don't know what this means and how this translates to your life. That means for most people, it's like, I don't see this thing. The numbers are so low. How is this supposed to affect me in any meaningful way in 2 or 3 months? I will go outside. I will not listen to the government. I will not vote for that person who says I have to stay at home. Before the whole pandemic starts. Now it starts because people didn't care about it. And you will vote for the wrong person because you vote for the person that doesn't care about it. Now the pandemic starts because exponential growth has kicked in. This is like the oh shit moment where people rally around the flag. exactly like opening opposition said. People suddenly care massively, and they think that maybe their current government is something that is doing the positive. If the election is at this stage of the pandemic, people rally around the flag, they're in full crisis mode, and then their safety concern overrides every other decision that they want to make. Social equality suddenly doesn't matter sufficiently anymore. Long-term stuff like climate change doesn't matter anymore. We've seen this in most Western countries where green parties, leftist parties massively dropped in population because they're talking about long-term stuff and fuzzy things like social inequality, and therefore not being voted for. And then you have situations or reasons for why people reopen too early. Before that,
Can you give us a single structural reason for why people who propose understandable solutions to a pandemic would not also otherwise be good governance?
The whole thing I'm talking about is that your average citizen is probably not as good as an informed expert on a disease as actual experts, and experts inform politicians. So on our side of the house, you have experts who inform politicians. On your side of the house, you have individuals who are not taught in this, who inform the decisions, and therefore they are less good at doing so. Lastly, the last stage of a pandemic. We think it's way more likely that people are going to reopen too early because of populist pressure. Number one, it's often certain mathematical concepts that are harder to grasp than others. Many people didn't believe that super spreaders existed until they existed and where experts all the time said they will exist, and therefore they think, I won't make a difference. They go out anyway, even though they're super spreader. Often people are just annoyed at some point, even though they know it's rational to stay at home. They are just annoyed that they have to teach their kids. They're pressuring to reopen the school, and they don't make the rational trade-off. Lastly, their savings run out at some point. They even have rational incentives to go back to work, and we need a government that says you can't go to work and that is not directly affected by these individuals. At the end of the day, representation is the most important thing, and representation is not given if you don't have the right people in place, and these are experts.
Thank the member of government very much. Excuse me. And if the judges are ready, I'm very happy to call upon the government whip. Yes, indeed, the member of opposition to start the case for closing opposition. Sorry.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. All right. So, panel, I think this debate is going to a rather predictable stalemate, where proposition mainly says that people are going to die, and opposition mainly tells us that accountability is incredibly important. I'm going to win under both aspects. One, I'm going to give you 4 independent reasons on why the pandemic actually gets worse when you postpone elections, and therefore why we save lives, also winning on the pros metric. 2, I'm going to explain why we need now accountability and give you a way more nuanced characterization than opposition did. Now, only 2 points of rebuttal doesn't fit in. The first is a general observation about the prop bench as a whole, and that is basically that people are idiots and that that good measures are unpopular. I know this works generally in debating, but it's empirically false here. Firstly, just empirically, we see that people are actually in favor of relatively strict measure. In the US, people were literally begging Trump for further lockdown to shut down, but because of corporate capture and because all the kind of billionaires were there, that simply wasn't being listened to. But there are also analytical reasons why this is different. The reason people are idiots is because they have trouble thinking far ahead and trouble conceptualizing abstract concepts. Both are necessary here. You literally have a ticker saying how much people die. People don't like being deaf, but also because it's a direct threat being posed to you. That's why we actually see that the corona measures are significantly more popular. I think that's a large part of the preference response. Secondly, I want to quickly deal with voter suppression. Copenhagen government tells us that voters are minority voters are less likely to turn up. I think this point is fully dependent on whether elections can be safe or not, because at the moment it can be held safe, then there's no risk whatsoever and they show up. We would like to point out, though, that voter suppression generally happens because of temporary measures, aka having to register in the UK or needing to have a valid driver's license in the US. The point is that all of those are temporary, and given the fact that they are tied to elections, they're very likely to expire the moment the postponed election takes place. They need that again, you need to pay $50, or again, you need to pay a lot of time, and that's crucial for these vulnerable people. So I think voter suppression is actually way more likely on the death side of of the House. I had it as an independent extension, but I think I've dealt with it elaborately now. So let's talk about how the pandemic gets worse. First, I want to quickly get out on the way because I do think elections can be held safe. Notice that quick tests already exist. In a couple of hours, you know whether you have corona or not. It's very easy to get people to the voting booth, quick test them, and send them home at the moment they don't simply accept it, or even test them at home and send them the test beforehand. Also know that we can do this outside, where the spread is significantly lower. Also notice that we can, for example, have an election held over multiple days, so that not many people actually have to come together. Literally every reason you can think of why it will be dangerous is something we can circumvent. At the moment you throw enough money at the problem, that's something we're happy to do given the fact that the elections are quite important. Also, we have no clear issue whatsoever with mail-in ballots, or electronic voter fraud. There's literally conspiracy theory with Trump. I'm unsure why that's an issue. Second reason why this will actually worsen the crisis. I think the first important thing is to analyze is that the opposition is unhappy that the elections are getting pushed away. The first reason is because they're now not in power currently and would like to be in power. The second reason is given by OG, given the fact that they say that they are unsupportive, the government is unsupportive, therefore want to win. That means they're going to be pissed off that the elections are postponed, and it means they also want the election to be as soon as possible. The only proper way to do that is to accuse the government of over-exaggerating corona, basically saying the pandemic is over, so the elections can now be held properly, and push that. Why is that a problem? It means that the measures against corona get politicized, and that the government is going to be accused of doing them simply postpone the election. The fundamental issue here is that many voters take issues from people they held in high regard, aka their political leaders. When they literally say these measures are bullshit, they're only there to suppress your vote, it means people are far less likely to listen and to adhere to them. This is already happening in Germany with AFD supporters. It's starting to happening in the Netherlands. This is going to happen all over Europe and all over the world, where large groups of people are simply no longer going to listen to them. That means you have less compliance, it means people die. Also now this leads to a circle, because the pandemic growing means the elections need to be held even later, meaning you get even more push, even more people angry, even more people die. Thirdly, I want to talk about the government itself, because OG tells us that they're objective measures and they can be enforced by the WTO. I don't think the WTO can enforce them, and we have no clue what these objective measures are. I think OO did a good job of explaining that they don't exist. The first thing is that to give them a perverse incentive to make sure the pandemic actually lasts longer. Now, we're going to be nuanced here. We don't think governments want to kill off people to remain a bit longer in power, but notice that Bojo literally lied to Parliament in order to stick to power a little longer, and notice that Trump has already voted expanding the elections. This isn't just North Korea where it happens, it's happening in relatively functional democracies as well, and it's going to get worse. The reason is that you have multi-completing interests. So, for example, lobbyists want you to stick in power longer and pushing you not to implement this measure because the trade-off isn't worth it. But the second notion is that shorters are have a short-term memory. That's to say that at the moment you do something popular just before the election, then they're more likely to believe it. That is why the budget cuts are always in the beginning of the elections. This one gives you an incentive to implement the significant measures later, just before the election, because we told them you're popular and you get the voter boost just when you need it. But the third mechanism, more perniciously, is that under their side of the house, the elections are going to be held after the pandemic is over. It means you can do your victory lap, and it means people have forgotten what the pandemic actually looked like. The thing they didn't vote on is the thing they always vote on, the economy. The fundamental issue then is that you have a perverse incentive to wait with the corona measures or to downplay it, because the moment you held elections, everyone has forgotten about them, but you do have significant harms to the economy. So the government is going to treat it worse. Fourthly, you're going to get massive protests. One, because people hate this, and two, because they have no other way to express this. Notice that there have been protests against COVID measures. Think of what happens at the moment the elections actually gets postponed. Protests are super spreading events, because by definition there have to be a lot of people, and because by definition they have to be pissed off. And also notice that I explain why the measures are being politicized, and therefore wearing a mask will be massively unpopular. That literally means thousands more people are going to get infected. You get a significantly worse pandemic on the death of the house. But two, I want to show you in a more nuanced way why I think accountability is more necessary than ever. Notice that corporate capture and lobbying has been massive in times of corona. We saw a massive bailout of the very big companies. Notice also that people were forced going to work simply to work for billionaires, even if they desperately want to stay home in the US. There are two issues here. One, we think now more than ever, we need to actually vote the governments out and to give a proper counter incentive against listening to those people. But the second, more harmful one, is that the campaigns that have already started will longer on for much longer. It means you're way more dependent on your donors, given the fact that you need a campaign budget for a significantly longer time. Therefore, even more power and even more sway over you. At the moment the elections are there, the handouts have already taken place, people have already died working for billionaires, and already the donors have gotten significantly more powerful. Lastly, I want to talk about backsliding democracy. Notice that measures against COVID has been used to shut down opposition in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Russia. Protests have been banned in Suriname. The press was deemed as non-essential and therefore couldn't go out after curfew. The issue, firstly, is that you simply can't correct this. But I think the long-term issue is that you shift the frame of what is normal. In France, after the Bataclan attacks, you got a state of emergency. It's still persisting to this day. Because at the moment you have something adapted to normal, people start perceiving that as normal. They're unlikely to deal with it. In 6 months, when elections are being held, there's a new normal. That means the government is going to get away with much more. We think this worsens the pandemic. We think this is bad in terms of accountability. We are proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition member very much. Wait a few seconds. And if all
we're
judges
going over here because the internet is better than mine. For the
Sure.
So just 1 second.
Okay, 1 second while I sort my notes, please. Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah, I believe you are. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Let us start in 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Okay, panel. I think there's 3 important questions in this debate. The first question is, can elections be held safely during Corona? A. 2, are these elections likely going to be representative in terms of the interests that are represented at the elections and the kind of people that are able to attend the election? And thirdly, does this meaningfully change the handling of the crisis? Let's quickly start with the last one, which was like a major contention in opening half and also something that closing opposition said. And like in closing government, we're just very doubtful that elections have a large effect on the handling of the crisis in either world. Why is that? So note that the necessary premise that teams who want to argue that elections either improve or disprove the handling of the crisis need to show is that voters writ large understand what good Corona policy and bad Corona policy is. However, what we've already explained to you in Maria's speech is that understanding the crisis is incredibly difficult because understanding the correct policy response to it depends on a variety of different factors which the average voter just doesn't have access to and which cannot be effectively conveyed through media. And this factors a lot of different things into each other, which means if you're a bit informed, that just doesn't fucking cut it in this case. So you need to know statistics pretty well, but this isn't just it. You also need to understand how disease modeling works in the first place and how different modes of transition work. Then you need to understand, and this is really important because for most of Corona, we just had major knowledge gaps and major data gaps where we didn't know like how many cases are there? We didn't know how high are cases undercounted. We had a lot of uncertainty. So not only do you need to be a technical expert in a lot of specific fields, you also need to know how to operate with high informational uncertainty in general. And then you need to take in a lot of other factors. Like you not only need to know what is the ideal Corona policy, but also how is like the average population uptake of that policy? How do they react to it? What does this mean? We think on average, this means that voters just don't really know what the correct policy is, and they can't effectively, therefore, vote for governments which promise them better policy. Every politician is going to say, I'm going to do a good job. The way in which elections would check the politicians is if voters could effectively like test if politicians like could know which like proposed policy is better. note that when opening opposition says, oh, like you can see if the outcome is good or bad, and if the outcome is bad, you can vote in a different person, that also doesn't work because the outcome is dependent on a lot of underlying factors. Like the point is, we don't know what an ideal corona response in the US would have looked like, so we don't know how much worse Trump is. Now, Trump may be pretty bad, but in a lot of European countries, the question is very difficult. Like if Spain maybe just has a bad healthcare system, we don't know what a good Spain and a bad Spain response would have looked like. So this means, I think, largely the response to coronavirus is not something that meaningfully changes in the debate on either side through an election. It is something that like just depends on a lot of like kind of random and fundamental factors, but not something that this election changes. So what really is the delta in this debate? And I think here what matters is how representative are these elections going to be? Because ultimately the elections are going to have ramifications beyond the coronavirus, where it's important that the interests of a lot of different people are accurately represented. And here we think, A, elections are going to be unsafe, and as a rational result, a lot of people are going to abstain from voting or not be able to vote, and this will cause the overall result to be A, unrepresentative, but specifically unfair towards certain kind of minorities. Okay, so how did we argue this? So we explained to you that in a lot of ways, like voting systems currently just aren't able to facilitate elections in a safe manner with in-person voting. And the thing is then, like we hear from closing opposition that, oh, like quick tests exist and you might be able to hold it over different days and maybe you just need to throw money at it, but they need to show that this is likely to happen in reality. What Marius told you is that the average poll station is severely underfunded, has human capital constraints, doesn't have a lot of expert at its hand, and is oftentimes just doesn't have enough money and not enough experience with it. Because countries don't know how to deal with voting during a pandemic, that's not something that they've like been able to accumulate expertise on, and so as a result are unlikely to react well to. Then you can say, oh, mail-in ballots exist. However, no team on opposition has explained to us how you can scale up an alternative voting system that is usually intended for maybe 5% of the population by like a factor of 50 to effectively address most of the population. This is something that's an incredibly hard logistics problem where you need to know a lot of different things and be able to scale up. This might be something that Amazon might be able to do in years, not something that like Southern Louisiana can do in a matter of a couple of weeks. This is an incredibly difficult problem, and no opposition has explained to us how this is likely going to be solved. What this means is what we've seen in a lot of elections that have been held in the US on a local level, is thousands of mail-in ballots aren't delivered. A lot of people are afraid to go vote. Like the average voter participation is just way lower. I'll take opening opposition now.
Please explain why politicians are structurally likely to listen to experts on your side, given all the counter-incentives we explained that have thus far gone unresponded, e.g. corporate capture, etc.
Oh, okay. Like, I don't think politicians are a lot more likely to listen to experts on either side. I just don't think this is the deciding issue on the debate. I think what matters is, are elections representative? And on your side, they're less representative than if they were held afterwards. In what ways are they specifically unrepresentative? The problem is minorities are hit harder by the corona crisis for a variety of factors, and as a result are going to fear going to the polls more, A. But B, in a lot of ways, they're also usually less able to make use of mail-in voting because they're less informed about these options, because maybe they don't have official addresses, because like maybe their addresses aren't registered in the system, because it's just really fucking difficult to scale up these systems. As a result, the interests of the people that are going to be hit the hardest in this crisis and that are going to need the help the most after the crisis has ended are going to be the least represented in the system, not just for the duration of the crisis, but for far longer afterwards. This is the problem that we've identified, the problem that is irrespective of voters being rational or irrational or experts being listened to. I think, so quickly on closing opposition, I just think their case is in massive tension with opening opposition when they tell you that governments want to postpone elections to be more popular, when opening opposition talks to you about a lot of rally around the flag effects where governments would then presumably want to hold elections more quickly. I think in general, it's very unclear what elections do to coronavirus responses. These are really complicated, but they do make elections less representative. This is something we genuinely and solidly should care about. Please propose.
We thank the government whip. If you'll forgive me for exactly 5 seconds, it's become a little dark here. So just 1 second, please. Better. We thank the government whip very much. And if the judges are ready, we are very happy to call upon the opposition whip to conclude the opposition bench and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Cool. I think we take this debate essentially over the government bench, because the government bench never explains why without elections you are able to have good measures. We tell you that elections are the only way to counter perverse incentives. Note that analysis also immediately drags us over opening opposition. Opening opposition tells you that companies have incentives to make lockdowns less good. We tell you that corporate incentives to make sure that lockdowns don't occur, because then they can operate, and having no elections together means that politicians have an incentive to keep Corona going, because during that time they get lobbying money. But secondly, and crucially, after the pandemic is done, other incentives kick in, other policy issues kick in. And one of the most salient policy aspects is often the economy. That means that if as a government you are able to postpone the election till after the pandemic, when the economy all of a sudden becomes a primary issue, we tell you that you have a perverse incentive to not care about the pandemic and to actually make sure that you don't have Corona measures in place. I think that means that we go further than opening opposition, as opening opposition tells you that it's simply unlikely we get the specific perverse incentives as to why you need elections in order to counter this. Without elections, politicians don't have an incentive to listen to the people that actually very often do want lockdown measures, right? Because they don't like dying and they do like being able to work safely. That is why they want lockdown measures. They want to be able to go back to work as soon as they can. So let's first engage a little bit with CG. CG tells you that people will be unable to access the ballot and therefore it's unrepresentative. I have a few issues with this. First of all, I don't think that they ever engage with the actual argument that Roel makes about voter suppression, right? That often it's an organizational thing where the government tells you that you need a driver's license, that you need a specific type of ID. The problem is that those things expire. The problem is if they expire till after the election, because governments keep postponing them, that means that all of a sudden people don't have their driver's license, don't have their ID that they otherwise would have had. That costs a lot of money. I think you actually suppress more people by postponing. But second of all, note that people really want to vote and they really don't want to get Corona. That is what Roel explains to you at the moment that he talks about the anger that will come with the fact that that the government postpone elections. That also means that there's political capital, right? To invest in quick tests, to invest in more polling stations, to invest in assigning time slots. I think therefore that our extension is actually the extension that explains why governments will be likely to invest in making voting safe. But then I want to talk about their whole idea of, but minorities will be unwilling to vote. I have two issues with this. First of all, I think this is actually the group that has most to gain, right? Those are the people that are screwed over most, given that they can't go to work. So I think that many of these people are willing to take the risk. Second of all, note that at least with elections, but with worse representation, we have some representation, right? I don't think they ever trade off how this works. 4-year afters, they can vote again. They never explain the comparative harm here. I don't think that there is a delta. Let's then move on. So CG tries to tell you that people are too stupid to understand like how a pandemic works. Note that it's essentially an STD with coughing, and 13-year-olds can understand STDs, right? But knows also that these numbers are very easy to compare, namely pre-policy and post-policy. At the moment that lockdown measures are being stopped, that means that you immediately see the effects, right? That's what happened in the Netherlands. We see a spike in Corona cases again. But crucially, what we tell you is that opposition is necessary. If people don't understand what better alternatives are and how it works, the government, if elections can be postponed till after the crisis, don't have an incentive to educate people, because the longer they don't educate people, the longer that they can keep fooling people to prevent that they are ever voted out of office. We tell you that opposition here has a crucial role to play, right? Because they can tell you what better policy alternatives are if people don't get it. They can explain how to flatten the curve if people do not get it. Governments will not have the incentive to educate the people. Opposition will, right? So we think that that legitimate scrutiny that comes with elections, comes with debates, comes with a lot of political attention is incredibly necessary. Then let me talk about the politicization of the pandemic, because OG tries to tell you that people don't want measures, but that people don't want measures and therefore the health crisis management is worse. I think that Roel counters this incredibly effectively, right? When he talks about how you politicize the crisis. Know that a lot of populist parties are already not a fan of what the government is doing to infringe on people's rights. Note what happens at the moment that they're literally canceling elections, the only way in which the voice of the people can be heard, something that populist parties hugely base their platform on. I think that leads to three important issues. First of all, you get more populists. The problem is that often exactly those policies are based on a lack of education, right? So those are exactly the parties that are unwilling to have more lockdowns. I think therefore you only make corona or other infectious diseases worse. So if anything, worsening populism is the most important thing. Second of all, Roel tells you that you get more protests because people are angry that they can't vote, right? Those events are specifically super spreaders, no engagement from CG. But third of all, note that you get less compliance, right? Because all of a sudden, corona becomes a political tool that the government is using in order to make sure that they can stay in power. That means that people start seeing conspiracy in that, right? The lockdowns are no longer needed. The government is fooling you into thinking that they're needed. That means that you get less compliance and actually the crisis gets worse. Before I move on, I'd like to take a POI from OG.
So politicians can't drag corona forever because you probably don't want to end up completely isolated, economically drained, and you don't want people you even personally know into danger. Politicians are not lizards. Given that you want to presumably want to get reelected when elections will inevitably happen, you have an incentive to handle it well based on expert advice so you can get elected after.
So one, I think that literally our extension is you can gain power through corporate lobby. That means that you listen to the corporate lobby and simultaneously you try to postpone the election while fooling people that corona is still very much a major issue, right? So I don't think that a POI actually answers our case that well. So I think in that sense, right, who has proven to you that for politicians, it's a win-win. They can get their economic growth and they can get their power and they can get their corporate lobby. That means that we think that people are more likely to actually vote for these politicians afterwards, even though they made the crisis worse, right? Because they can trick people into thinking that they did the best they can and that they tried to do the good balancing act between corona and the economy. While in reality, they were just listening to the corporate lobby that gives them the campaign funds that they so much need. I think that at the end of the debate, Wu proves to you a few crucial things. He tells you that populism is the one key that we need to take out in order to prevent infectious diseases. He explains to you that the corporate lobby will destroy any type of chance that we have at fighting a pandemic. Please vote CO.
We thank the opposition whip very much, and indeed all the speakers for a fine semi-final. Let's have a round of applause for all teams in the semi-final. Thank you very much, everyone. The judges